You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Northern California Director for High-Speed Rail, Boris Lipkin, and Streetsblog San Francisco Editor, Roger Rudick, to talk about high-speed rail's progress in California. Boris discusses what's next for high-speed rail, and Roger pushes back on recent negative media. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Heavy knit bus or bike only, or lightweight bike only with fading checkerboard design. Sign up at patreon.com/theoverheadwire and I'll send one right along. You can also purchase the scarves at theoverheadwire.com. Get your fresh Elmo or fresh Kermit before winter arrives. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire daily newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Boris Lipkin and Roger Rudick, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thanks for being here. Boris, we had you on in episode 284 right at the start of the pandemic, I believe May 2020, and so things are a little bit different now, I imagine, than when we first talked. But Roger, we've never had you on the show before. So one thing we do is ask people to tell us a little bit about themselves. So Roger, if you could start and give us a little background on you and your interests, and then we'll go with Boris to kind of give people a refresher about where Boris is coming from.
Sure. I've been a reporter who specializes in transportation issues, not to date myself, but about 30 years now. I've had stuff published in the New York Times. It's been a while, but the LA Times. I worked for an NPR affiliate in Los Angeles for many years. And for the last 7 years, I've been the editor of Streetsblog San Francisco, which obviously, Jeffrey, you know very well because we carry all your podcasts. And actually, in that time, I've done a lot of coverage of California's high-speed rail project. That's been kind of a specialty of mine. That's me.
Boris?
Sure. Boris Lipkin, Northern California Regional Director with the High-Speed Rail Authority. I've been in this role since 2018, leading our work in the Bay Area and in Northern California. But I've worked on the program since 2011, so in a variety of different roles. So had a chance to see it from different perspectives and sort of as the system has developed and grown and our work has progressed over time.
Awesome. Well, so let's get into California high-speed rail, shall we? You know, Boris, last time we talked and last time you were here, the draft environmental impact work for the Merced to San Francisco segment was just going live. Where does that stand now?
It's been a productive couple of years. And so we, in Northern California, actually just completed our environmental clearance for the 2 project sections, both for San Francisco, San Jose. We finished that in August, and San Jose to Merced in April of this year. And so we now have full environmental clearance to connect from the Central Valley, where we have construction already well underway with over 100 miles of the system being built. And now we have the path to getting to the Bay Area. We also have, in just the last year, finished the environmental clearance on 2 of the sections in Southern California and leaving just one more section between Palmdale and Burbank before we have the entire stretch between San Francisco and Los Angeles environmentally cleared. And so when we talked in 2020, we only had environmental clearance in the Central Valley. And we were, of course, advancing that work as quickly as we could. But now we have a lot more completed statewide, and it's been really important progress in all parts of the state during, frankly, the pandemic and everything else that we've all been dealing with over the last couple of years.
So what does that mean, environmental clearance? Like, what does that mean for the whole project, as it were? Does that mean you can start construction right away, or does that mean you have to do something else? What's the process there?
That's a great question. So environmental clearance, it has a few both specific and project-related importances as well as some symbolic ones. On the project side, being environmentally cleared means that you can go out and start doing things in the real world. So you can acquire right-of-way, start moving utilities out of the way, ultimately do construction. It also means that you've advanced the project enough where you've defined it. You're not looking at new alternatives or new routes. You've locked in, you've committed to a specific set of alignments, a specific set of mitigations, address the community impacts that have come along. or environmental impacts that the project will address. And so you've really defined the program and defined what the scope is and what's in and what's out in a pretty comprehensive way. The other thing that's important about environmental clearance work is that it is often a marker of project readiness. And so when you're talking about federal funding opportunities and the way that, funding agencies tend to look at things is if you're not environmentally cleared, there's a level of uncertainty around how long it might take you to get from, if we give you $1, how long it'll take you until you get that, dollar on the ground. And so having gone through these steps, we're in a different ballgame of talking to potential funders from the federal government and other places about what we need and how quickly we can put the funds to use in advancing the work. And then lastly, just from a statewide perspective, we have had a commitment to the federal government to fully environmentally clear the system. And that's been one of those, it goes back to our original grants that we got that basically helped fund the construction in the Central Valley, but also making sure that we are a statewide system, making sure that the rest of the system is also ready to go. And so all of those are the pieces of why this is really important, why these are such huge milestones, and they take, frankly, a long time to do. But we have gotten a lot of that done. We're now over 420 miles of the 500-mile system that's environmentally cleared. So it's an important milestone that's largely, not fully, but largely behind us at this point.
There's a lot of construction going on, and my brother-in-law in Bakersfield always sends me pictures of structures when he's out in the Central Valley. So I kind of want to know what's going on there as well. What's the progress so far? I know that Roger and some of the other Streetsblog writers went on a tour to see kind of some of the construction, but what's the feeling like in the Central Valley in terms of like how much is completed and how much is needed to finish it up?
So we have over 100 miles under construction, 119 miles to be precise, in the Central Valley. That's the largest new rail line that we're building anywhere in the country. It's probably the biggest new rail line in the last 100 years, frankly. But where things are at is we have 3 construction packages. The first one of those will be completed next year in 2023. The other ones are a little bit further, have a little bit more time to go on them. But if you're going through the Central Valley, there's dozens of structures that are up. Some of these are huge, and you can see them from Highway 99 if you're driving on there. If you want to see some of the construction, we also have a website, buildhsr.com, which has, drone footage, videos, photos from all sorts of the different pieces of the system. And you can even go on Google Earth and you'll find it from space. There's enough of the alignment that you can clearly see it from satellite imagery. And so that's where the current construction is at. We've also recently awarded the contracts to design both the extensions that we need to do in the Central Valley to get to Merced and to Bakersfield and the Central Valley stations. And so we're really turning to the next pieces of work, as well as the other kind of key contracts will be for the tracks and the systems, the electrification, the communication systems, et cetera, and for the actual trains themselves. And so we have a federal grant application in to purchase the first high-speed rail train sets. We're going to hear in the next few weeks whether that's successful, but there's lots of progress being made in the Valley and the construction. And I think in the next month or two, we'll have an update at our board about sort of overall status. So if folks want to tune in, that's another great opportunity to hear all the nuances of where each part of that construction work is.
Boris, when is the earliest that you might actually get a high-speed rail train set? I know a few weeks ago, Caltrain gave a tour of their Stadler equipment, and it was just very impressive to see it in San Francisco. And when that Caltrain electrification project is done, you won't be able to go very fast, but you'll actually have someplace you could plop one down and run it under its own power and show it to people, which I think would do a lot for people in the Bay Area, people in LA who don't get out to the Central Valley very often. Is there a time frame for when that might happen?
Yeah, so first, we're super excited to see the progress on Caltrain electrification and seeing their EMUs. That's on a different scale, but this is the kind of train that we're talking about for high-speed rail. And so modern electric equipment is something that's very different than what many California transit riders have experienced. So I think that's great. And, we're certainly very excited about that. In terms of our rolling stock procurement, the goal is to get that going next year. That means that sort of towards the second half of this decade, we would start to see some of the trains being tested and then ultimately put into service by the end of the decade. That's the goal.
Okay. And these are going to be similar to what Amtrak is purchasing for its newest Acela sets?
I think those...
You can't say for sure. But...
Yeah, I don't think I know enough to... I know that Amtrak on the Acelas doesn't run... it runs at, I think, about a maximum speed of 150, 160 miles an hour. Ours will need to go up to 220 miles an hour. So, a little bit more horsepower. But, generally, EMU train sets that will be similar to if folks have experienced the high-speed systems, around the world, either in Western Europe or Asia. We're really looking for market-proven train set technologies that are already out there in service and consistent with what kind of international best practices are.
Boris, I've walked on it, but the image behind you is the Fresno River Viaduct. Is that right?
This is the Cedar Viaduct.
The Cedar Viaduct. Okay. So I've seen a lot of images of very dramatic structures in the Central Valley, and Jeffrey mentioned his relative who's seen some of those. What's, I think, much harder to conceptualize, and maybe you can give us some idea of how much of this has been done, is the just miles and miles of basically just dirt right-of-way between these huge structures, which are almost equally important, right? Because that's, the track laying equipment's going to have to go down the whole thing. Can you give us a sense of how much of that is finished?
Yes. I mean, the majority of that is basically ready to go. I can get you more precise numbers, I think in terms of the miles of guideway that are complete, but it is miles and miles of the stuff. And each construction contract has a combination. It covers a stretch. And so the long lead time items are the structures. That's why you see those being built first. The at-grade guideway is a relatively, simple in terms of the construction work involved. And so most of that has already been acquired. Most of that has been prepared, but I can get you a more precise number after in terms of the percentage, but it's well over half. Whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, I'd have to go and get you a more precise number.
So we'll step back from the specific technical details for a second, but there's also been a lot of, press about high-speed rail in California, especially from national news media. I think a lot of folks have seen that New York Times article from our favorite Ralph Vardabidian circulating through the discussion realms of Twitter and other places. Roger, I'm wondering kind of what your first reaction is to seeing the headline, the article itself, and the reaction to high-speed rail from the eyes of a specific person who tends to inflame local advocates.
So when that article came out, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, and for people who aren't familiar with it, it's How California's Bullet Train Went Off the Rails. Pretty facile headline. And actually everyone who knows me professionally and personally, or pretty much everyone, sent me the link. Oh, did you see this new article in the New York Times? Not only did I see it already, but it's the same writer that we've been dealing with for, I don't know, maybe it's 15 years now, who'd been writing for the Los Angeles Times. And his reporting is, how shall I put it? He's continually catastrophizing the entire project. Occasionally points out things that are legitimate criticisms. I could bring them up with Boris, but I think we're all familiar with them. But he always looks at everything in the worst possible light. But it's kind of worse than that. He takes stuff out of context. A great example of that from the New York Times piece was he quoted, and, I don't have the time or the energy to go through all the quotes, but I think they're all more or less like this. He quoted Dan Richard, who is the former chairman of the High Speed Rail Authority. I've interviewed Dan myself several times, and I'm sure Boris has dealt with him a million times. But the quote that he used, he's only got 3 words actually in quotes in the New York Times article from Dan Richard, and it says, "a strategic mistake." So I looked at that, and the rest of the paragraph is saying that, out of the many disastrous mistakes that the High Speed Rail Authority supposedly made, was they decided to connect LA and San Francisco instead of LA and San Diego. So it's sort of a paraphrase of Dan Richard, and then it says, quote, "a strategic mistake," as if it was a strategic mistake to try and connect LA and San Francisco in the first place. So I looked at that and I said, no, Dan didn't say that. I know Dan. He did not say that. That's impossible. So I reached out to him this morning, and he got right back to me. And sure enough, it was, I said those 3 words. The rest of it is completely out of context. So here's what Dan was actually saying, and this is through my interpretation. You could maybe say I'm biased, but I'm sure Dan would back me up on this, that this is accurate. What he was saying is if we want to get a foothold of real high-speed rail, like they have in Japan, like they have in France, like they have in Germany, in the United States, in retrospect, it might have been a better approach to try and get 2 close-in cities connected, like LA and San Diego, so people in the United States could see a train going 200 miles an hour on their own soil. In other words, to sort of get people into the groove of it. That's very different from saying the entire project is off the rails, which it isn't. And Dan also said he very much supports the decision to go LA to San Francisco. It's also kind of a stupid point to be making this late into the project by Vardabidian, but it's his pattern of just like trying to find any way, even if you're changing the meaning of what somebody said, to make the project look bad. If we want to talk about LA to San Diego in that decision, they actually did make attempts to do it, and it ran into the same political pushback that's happened with this iteration of building a high-speed rail project in the United States. And also, they have pretty good rail service between LA and San Diego. I personally think that would have been a stupid idea to build sort of a duplicative service that's going to go a lot faster when you could invest some money in speeding up the existing Surfliner service between LA and San Diego, which, they need specific investment. The thing's actually closed down right now because of erosion. So they certainly need a few $1 billion to recreate some of the right-of-way inland. But anyway, getting back to Ralph Artebedian, that's been his pattern throughout his years of attacking the high-speed rail project. The most extreme case was, I think, in 2011. Japan had just had one of the worst earthquakes in world history, and I think the worst or close to the worst that they've ever had. We're all familiar with it. It set off the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The shaking was horrific. So shortly afterwards, Artebedian wrote a story about how complex it is to build high-speed rail in a state that has earthquakes. It is complex. It's difficult. Now, I stop and I'm like, well, of course, the first thing you'd have to talk about is how did the Japanese high-speed rail system fare in the Sendai earthquake, right? In 2011. He didn't mention it in the story. Didn't even mention it. So you're like, well, why didn't he mention it? So I wrote a letter to the editor and I said, there were 27, I think it was about 27 high-speed rail or bullet trains near Sendai, near the parts of Japan that shook the most. And nobody was injured, at least not seriously. It was a bad experience. I read some accounts of it. The brakes came on automatically because they have protection systems that'll detect the earthquake, kind of like the shake alert system that went off for us just a couple of days ago. Smoke coming out of the brakes. It was terrifying. It was rough, but everybody was fine. So it turned out the bullet trains were probably one of the safest places to be in Japan during that earthquake. Buildings were destroyed. Thousands of people died. We know about Fukushima. So I wrote that letter to the LA Times, and they called me back and said, it's a good letter, we're going to publish it. And then they just didn't. And they published all these really critical letters. So you're sort of like, okay, is that bias? Like, what is going on here? And all his stories are like that. Look, I think high-speed rail is the solution to our emissions problems. I think it'll help reduce the number of fatalities on our roads. I've, lived in the UK for a couple of years and in Brussels for about half a year. I used to ride it all the time over there. It's convenient. It's comfortable. There is, if we had a high-speed rail system today between LA and San Francisco, you would never get me on an airplane on that route. Like, why would I do that to myself? It's just so much nicer to take a high-speed train. So, I'm biased in favor, I guess. But if someone were just biased against, you'd be able to read that. But his stories, man, I don't know. It's like, I can't bust into his bank accounts. I don't have the resources to follow him around, but something's going on here. This isn't just a reporter who doesn't particularly like high-speed rail. It's just weird. And I'm really disappointed in the New York Times for publishing him, frankly. And I'm disappointed in the LA Times for letting this go on for so long. I mean, I don't know how many of our listeners were old enough to remember Judith Miller at the New York Times in the run-up to the Iraq War, but they've had reporters who've done this, at the New York Times, actually, who just write incredibly biased stories and just do really, really bad journalism. And it just goes on and on and on. And, sometimes they get caught and fired and sometimes they don't. And, it's unfortunate because people read that New York Times story and they assume it's been vetted. And they assume what they're reading is balanced and legitimate. And it's not. It just isn't. I mean, that Dan Richard quote, what do you say about that? Like, why was that in the story? Well, we know why.
Yeah, I think the most frustrating thing for me is that since I've been reading stories about this for such a long time, like opening up the New York Times article, reading the byline, and then just immediately closing it is, my first reaction. And that's what I did. And I even tweeted that. I was like, I opened it and I closed it. I didn't even know what was in the article. And I went back and read it later, obviously, because it's just part of the job. But it's frustrating. And I think it's frustrating to rehash a lot of the alignment decisions that were made. We had those arguments, and you can make a case maybe, for going up I-5 or something along those lines, but that's the decision that wasn't made. So I think that's a frustrating thing to me. And basically playing it out on the national stage, like the New York Times has, is another frustration, because then you get a lot of other people coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh, well, maybe aviation is just the best way to go because X, Y, and Z. And so the armchair analysis, the Monday morning quarterbacking coming out of the expert Arati on Twitter was inflaming as well. That's not to say that there's not, issues with California high-speed rail, or we have disagreements about some of the things that have happened in the past. But where we are now with all this environmental clearance that Boris just mentioned, all the things that are going forward and the excitement that's happening in the Central Valley about the construction, a lot of the jobs that have been created, et cetera. And I probably sound like a booster as well, which is frustrating, I think, to people. Somebody called me out for, I think I mentioned, I have family in Bakersfield and I'd love to ride high-speed rail to get there. And they're like, well, you have vested interests. And I was like, well, people have vested interests about stuff all the time related to this
also,
stuff.
you're not biased if you're honest. Right? If you say, I have family in Bakersfield, here's my point of view, okay? You're no longer, you're presenting your potential bias up front, right? Sure. And that's a legitimate thing to do as a journalist. One of the reporters I work with, this is why I've never actually had to do it myself, but actually called Vartabedian up and said, hey man, what gives? And he claims he's unbiased. He claims he's just being critical. I'm like, no, you're not. Sorry. Now, if he has family that's losing an orchard or something, I mean, he's got to come out and say that. If he's getting a check from the oil companies or car companies or something, he's got to, well, he's not going to say that, but you know what I mean.
So I wanted to ask Boris a question really quick. And Boris, this is something that obviously has been, you've been paying attention to for a long time, but the funding for the California high-speed rail line, it's been, I imagine, frustrating to see a lot of politicians, say in the Central Valley, who probably have read the New York Times article and kind of use it as a prop to deny funding. And it's probably been frustrating also to watch a lot of the discussions around these Senate bills that have been passed, the infrastructure bill, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which are weird names for these things, but it's how it works, right? And so I'm wondering what your feelings are when there's all this discussion about, okay, we're having a hard time paying for it, but then a lot of the funding from national level sources and other sources is hard to come by because of some of the things that are written, or maybe just because of some of the quote unquote biases that Congress critters have.
Sure. I mean, I think the funding picture it's an interesting one because there's sort of the outside world view of it, and then there's the, project view of some of the stuff. And sure, I would love to live in an environment which, some other countries have, which when, the population or the parliament or whatever approves the project's fully funded. And then all it is about delivery and executing the project. That's not the world that we live in. And so California put the idea in, frankly, including some of the alignment choices that we've just been talking about and that were in that article, before the voters in 2008 and said, voters of California, do you want us to start building a high-speed rail system? And here's what it will generally look like. Here's where it'll generally go. Here's the places it'll connect. And that bond measure included a funding that would be 1/5 of the cost of the system at the time. And it said, if you want to actually spend this money on construction, which we want you to do if the voters vote yes, which they did, then you have to find matching funds somewhere else. And at that point, there was nowhere else. But what you've seen in the last decade that I've worked on the program is every few years there's a funding milestone. So first we had Prop 1A, then we got federal funds to match that and begin construction. Then a few years later we got cap and trade funds. That was sort of our first long-term funding source from the state. Then the cap and trade system program got extended, giving us an extra runway on those funds. We then start to see, the new funding sources coming into play with the federal government out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we're very excited about what that can bring. Just this last year in the legislature, we had the appropriation of the remaining Proposition 1A funds, which gives us the next boost. And frankly, that's what we've seen with large infrastructure projects in the US, is that we do these things in building blocks, and we find the funds to do the next piece and do the next piece and do the next piece, and eventually you have a whole system. Now, would it be better perhaps if we did it the way that many other countries have done it, which is, basically fund the whole thing all at once? Sure. But that's never been the reality. And so we live in the world that we have, where we certainly see the importance of leveraging the state funds that we have. And we're very lucky to have strong support within the states and frankly, now clear direction in terms of our political leadership of how they want to see the program advanced. And then leveraging that with new federal funding opportunities. The bipartisan infrastructure law is a huge opportunity that hasn't existed in the last decade plus. And so we're certainly excited to see those programs at the federal level. And then even at the regional level, we have great examples of partnerships, everything from Caltrain electrification, where we're providing about 1/3 of the funding and others are coming in with the rest of it to get that line electrified. We have the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the MTC in the Bay Area, basically saying that bringing high-speed rail to the Bay Area is a regional priority for discretionary funds as part of their long-range plan. And really, these are the kinds of things that it'll take for the program to come about. And, I think we'll continue to see the pattern of we continue to move forward, we advance the work, we position ourselves, we pursue funding, from all sources, and the program continues to grow and gets implemented, and the building blocks come together. So, to me, the funding picture is frankly brighter in sitting here in 2022 than it's been, at least for the last 5, 6, 7 years on the program. So I think this is a good time for high-speed rail. And, certainly those are, national conversations to be had about what kind of investments we want to make. But I think California has been at the forefront of all sorts of areas and policy areas, including, reduction, looking to reduce emissions, looking at equity issues. And I think the country's coming along. And so I'm very
Boris, you
optimistic.
mentioned the political kind of alignment that happened in order to kind of give you direction. Roger, I'm wondering how that came about in terms of getting some of these Los Angeles legislators on board and some of the politics and the background of what's been going on there, because it wasn't always smooth sailing to get some folks on board, and it still isn't. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you have some updates on that related to some of the pushback that's been coming from Southern California.
Well, yeah, I hope that battle has been fought and won now, as Boris was saying. Like, they've got the money actually from the state, which is, $4.2 billion, Boris, which was promised. It was sort of the last part of Prop 1A. This gives you an idea of how sort of weird and twisted the politics are. Ballot measure passed in 2008. Only this year did they get the last part of it, the $4.2 billion, so that they can keep building what they're building now. I think what you're referencing is that money was tied up for a long time because of two Southern California politicians, Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon and Laura Friedman, who represents, I believe it's Burbank and the kind of northern part of downtown Los Angeles. I forget where her district is, but it's sort of that chunk around Burbank. They had the power and the committee positions to jam up that money, even though the voters approved it, for well over a year. And it was really frustrating because, it was very obvious they were trying to leverage the funds to get more money dedicated to Southern California. And by the way, a significant portion of funds were already going to transit projects in Southern California that connect to high-speed rail. So, this was sort of baked into the original proposition that all regions of the state are getting investments. The fact that Boris is working in the Central Valley right now and in Northern California, it doesn't mean nothing's happening in Southern California. They built a whole new train station in Anaheim already with high-speed rail funds. They were pushing back against that last bit of funding from Prop 1A for kind of flexible reasons. Like, they kept changing. It became very obvious they were using it as a kind of a bargaining chip to get more money. For a long time they said, well, we shouldn't electrify the Central Valley, which is kind of the point of high-speed rail. You run it off electricity so it doesn't emit diesel fumes, diesel pollution. So they were talking about, well, let's run a diesel train in the Central Valley. All the studies show that would cause additional pollution to the Central Valley, which, as your relatives know, is already one of the most polluted areas of the country, if not the most polluted. It means the trains would not be able to go 200 miles an hour. They would go significantly slower than that, probably about half that speed. They wouldn't accelerate very well. There's a lot of issues with it jacking up the price of the overall project even more because you'd have to get the tracks ready to carry these diesel trains and then convert it to electric. This is funny. It actually ties back into Ralph Artavadian at the LA Times as well, because they were putting out reports that the law that the California voters actually approved never said that it had to be electrified in the first place. That is categorically false. And there were actually stories quoting them saying that unchallenged. The Prop 1A says right in it, it has to be electrified. For people who don't understand the technical issue with that, it means there's actually a high tension wire over the train that feeds power from a power plant, solar power plant, a wind farm, whatever it is. It can be as big as it needs to be. And the train is actually plugged directly into it. So the train is not carrying fuel. That allows it to be much, much lighter and much more efficient. When people kind of rejected the diesel idea, they invented the idea of running it on hydrogen or on battery power, which is pretty close to physically impossible. The technology we have is nowhere near being able to do this. And a lot of people who are reading these articles in the LA Times in California, I think, were very confused because they're sort of like, well, wait, we have Teslas now. Battery technology has advanced. And, without getting into the math too much, it has not advanced that much. This is more on the level of trying to figure out how to fly an airplane with batteries only. Like, it just doesn't really work. You can run a train at slow speeds on batteries over short distances. But when you're trying to go 200 miles an hour to make you competitive with air travel, it just doesn't work. It doesn't pencil out. I don't know that we'd ever have the technology to do that. And frankly, even if we did, if you have the power supply being generated somewhere other than on the train, you're still going to have a more efficient system. It's just the way it works. Personally, I think it's why oil companies don't like this. at all. I mean, it's the reason the Europeans and the Japanese produce far less CO2 than we do. And it's not by inventing some new technology or heavy regulations. It's just, this is how they get around most of the time. It's by electrified trains. If that answers your question, that's what was going on in Southern California. Finally, it became very obvious that Friedman and Rendon were proposing things that were not physically possible. I'd like to think some of that was from my own reporting and my own publications work, that we were sort of trying to explain that this just doesn't pencil out. And eventually they relented and released those funds. But, wasting a year did not make the California high-speed rail project get cheaper. Now, Boris, correct me if I'm wrong, you're now a year behind in putting out bids for high-speed rail equipment, which is very hard to get because there's a lot more people who need high-speed train sets to go on their tracks than there are manufacturers, right? And there's a long lag in building these things. So, they jack the price up. And then they'll turn around and say, why is it so expensive? And this goes on over and over and over again in a vicious cycle. Welcome to California projects, right?
It is frustrating. Now, Boris, you all just let some contracts expire in order to do some rebidding. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we had started procurement in 2019 for the track and systems work. And obviously since that time, and as we've been going, Roger talked about the appropriation request and that it took a little while for that to come about. Obviously, we've seen the impacts of COVID and now more recently inflation. And so we just decided to pull that back and rethink a little bit of the approach on that particular contract to make sure that we're getting the most favorable terms, frankly, that we can on the bids that would be coming in. But maybe the silver lining of all of that back and forth is, ultimately at this point, and with the budget agreement that got reached, we now have clear direction from the legislature about the prioritization of making sure that we have electrified two-track, passenger rail service between Bakersfield and Merced. That's a clear priority that both the governor and the legislature is now behind. And it gives us a clear path of how that interim service can get going. Sort of the other part of the deal was the governor ultimately agreeing to the establishment of an Office of Inspector General, which is very similar to something that Caltrans has. And, I think oversight is good. There's good to come of that as well. And so this is a different moment from where we are. And so it's a good moment to really make sure that we have a clear path forward, that the contracting strategy aligns with the realities.
Now,
that
Boris,
we
I also
face.
want to give you a hard time about you mentioned that some of the stations, the design work for the stations are being released. I noticed that, for example, in Kings Tulare, with the station there's a lot of parking. And it looks really suburban. As one of my friends, Eric Eidlin, would say, I would call it a beat field station, to use a French term for their high-speed rail, where they kind of have these stations in the middle of nowhere that provide parking. I'm hoping most of them are going to be more urban-type stations, but some of the renderings suggest otherwise. I'm curious what kind of the feedback that you all have gotten from those, from the renderings and from the station designs that have already come out.
Sure. And I think the thing for folks to realize is that each station is a little bit different, right? Switching to our region for just a second, and I'll talk about the Central Valley in a moment as well, but in our region, what we're talking about is all four of our Northern California stations. So San Francisco, Millbrae, SFO, San Jose, and Gilroy, they're all existing stations. And so what we're not talking about, beat field stations. We're talking about where
Right.
transit services are today and connecting the system to the regional transit network. That's why we are going where we're going. And, for example, in Gilroy, we looked at a station that was in East Gilroy, which would have been away from the existing transit services, and decided against it. So those are certainly, part of our view of the world. And that generally has been the approach. You look at the kind of Central Valley cities, in terms of where the station is in Fresno, close to Chinatown, close to downtown. And Kings Tulare is a different example in that it's basically located between two communities, Hanford and Visalia on either side. There's also a cross-valley rail line that's in the planning stages that would potentially connect at that station and have those east-west connections. But in that part of the world, frankly, you probably are going to need a little bit more parking, because that's how people currently get around. And if you want to have riders, get to those stations, that's your best bet. But that doesn't mean that that's the view of the world that we share. Obviously, as we get to places where there's robust transit systems, that's the goal. And, I think that's part of the differentiation between us and, for example, some of the private rail lines that have been talked about, or even high-speed lines in Texas and other places, is we want to be in downtowns. We want to have those land use connections. We want to have those transit connections. And we want to have this be part of an integrated and seamless statewide transit system and transportation system. And so, I think it's easy to sort of find, oh, hey, there's this station that, based on its unique kind of context, maybe isn't the urban dream that folks would have. But I think it would be, as maybe Roger was saying, out of context to use that to say that that's how all the stations are, because that's not really the reality.
I was a French exchange student in a little village outside of Lyon, about an hour from Lyon, so right near the Lyon-Paris line. And when it was time to go to Paris to get back to New York, where I grew up, there's actually, what they call a quote-unquote beat field station. It's just kind of a couple of platforms along the train line to serve the farming communities and the small villages around there. It's called Mâcon, and it's basically the two-track main line expands to 4 tracks. Now, most of the TGVs, the high-speed trains between Lyon and France, blow right through there at about 170 miles an hour. That's 1980s technology, went 175 miles per hour. But there were a handful of trains that pulled off the main line and stopped there. And yeah, it's just it's a couple of platforms and a little shed basically, and it's surrounded by farms and a parking lot. So there's room for that. If the Tulare station were going to get 20 trains a day, I would say that's ridiculous. But if they get a couple of trains a day for the farming communities, or even 4 trains a day, or whatever it's going to be, I think that's great. People in the Central Valley, even in rural farming areas, have the right to get to San Francisco and Los Angeles as well.
Well, that's another interesting point about the discussions about California high-speed rail as well, and the alignment decisions that we've made. I don't know if people actually understand how many people live in the Central Valley. I think folks probably think that everybody lives in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles, when there's 3.5 million plus people in that area that will benefit from connecting to the 2 of the largest regions in the world. And so it's interesting to have that discussion as well, and kind of remind people that there's a lot of people that live in the Central Valley. And I think that's something that is forgotten on some of these things, like the New York Times article, or the quote train to nowhere discussions that actually is not nowhere, it's actually somewhere. And I think that that's really important part of it as well.
I mean, I think it's just ignorance born of everybody flying or taking I-5. Like, if you take 99 and you go through those towns, you're like, oh, there's a lot of people who live here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jeff, your point was spot on about the Central Valley, and the comparisons that I tend to use, just to give people a sense who might not be from California, and having spent some time living in the Northeast Corridor, is, the population of Fresno is pretty close to the population of Baltimore. And I don't think anybody would think of Baltimore as, not a substantial city on the Northeast Corridor. Fresno's larger than the city of Atlanta. Obviously, Atlanta has a large metropolitan area around it, but these are not small places. And I think part of the reason that they get so overlooked is that geographic isolation that you have, where the Central Valley at times is a little bit of an island, not really connected to the coastal major metropolitan area, larger metropolitan areas of the Bay Area and, the Los Angeles basin. And part of the system, and it gets into that argument about I-5 and all those other things, is about connecting those different regions of California together and making it seamless. And I remember talking to some folks who worked on the German rail system. And of course, they had all the similar goals about, connecting their cities, increasing mobility, reducing emissions. All of that was part of the reasons why Germany invested so heavily in rail and high-speed rail to connect its population. But there was also an overarching kind of policy objective that the system was part of, which was the reunification of the country, when East Germany and West Germany became one again, and tying the 2 parts of the country together and building those physical transportation linkages in a way that, at least during the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, that really didn't exist in the same way. And I think you can sort of take that policy lens on the California system and look at the importance of connecting our regions together, what that means from an equity standpoint. The Central Valley has some of the worst air quality in the state, or even in the country. It has generally higher levels of unemployment and other economic challenges that we are all going to be better off as a state if we are more of one state. And we're talking about our global competitors. In the news, I think there was just an announcement that we might have just passed Germany as the 4th largest economy in the world. And so these are the investments that others are making. And so I think the Central Valley is a critical part of that. And it's a critical part of how our state operates.
Roger, do you have any closing remarks thinking about high-speed rail in California?
Yeah, just to give people a sense of proportion here. You always hear about how much this is costing us, right? So the budget of Caltrans, I just looked this up, is about $20 billion every year. So nearly every penny of that going to freeway maintenance and widening. 99 is getting widened. I was just up there a few months ago and got to look at all the work getting done. The state budget is $308 billion, I think, this year, the approved budget. Boris, check me on any of this if I've got him off a little bit. And we just finished a year about arguing about $4.2 billion to go to the high-speed rail project that was approved in 2008. So when I hear this project is very expensive, yes, it is. The amount of money that we are squandering on continually widening highways so that they can get jammed up with traffic all over again, which all have to be maintained and patrolled by CHP and given seismic retrofits. And then there's the toll, the collisions, and the air pollution. I don't know. The high-speed rail project looks pretty cheap to me.
Not to mention you can't expand the runways at SFO, Oakland, LAX, or Burbank. You can't. So there's a big argument there as well.
A little Southwest flight from Oakland to Burbank takes, or, San Francisco to LA, it takes just as much runway space as an Airbus, as a big transoceanic airplane. And those planes are going to become unnecessary when the high-speed rail project is operational.
I want to have that discussion at some point in the future. There's been a lot of research on airline emissions and high-speed rail and those types of things, which I've been frustrated by, but I'll save that for another time. Boris, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would sort of leave your listeners with is a little bit of the bigger picture perspective on the project that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about, specific headlines or the day-to-day of things. But when I started working on the program in 2011, there was really a decision to be made, about are we going to do high-speed rail in California or not? I mean, the voters had approved it. We had just been awarded the first tranche of federal funds, and there was a decision to make, do we start construction or not? And at that point, there was a real decision to be made about or not being one of the options that we could do. We had seen, other states with Republican governors send money back, Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida. And that was a real conversation. Obviously, you can see lots of progress that's been made over the last, decade since that conversation. But the reality of things in California with high-speed rail is no longer, are we going to do high-speed rail or not? It's going to be, how much high-speed rail are we going to do? How fast? And that's a very different set of conversations to be had, because there's no undoing, dozens of structures. There's no pulling back from the investments that have been made. And so it's about how do we maximize the benefits out of those existing set of investments? How do we tee up the next ones? And so this program will have challenges. It's complicated. It's big. It's, it impacts lots of people, but it also provides big benefits. And I think you'll see some of that start to turn when we really get trains going. The one historic comparison that I love is there's a headline from San Francisco Chronicle from, I think, about 1965 while BART system was being built. And it's, front page, Bay Area's, transit fantasy, $1 billion transit fantasy or something like that. And it's very critical of what was happening with BART at the time. Lots of controversy, issues in construction and all the things, not too dissimilar. And then you can find the article from 1972 when the BART system opened. And the San Francisco Chronicle article is all about how you ride the system, how it's a wonderful modern way of getting around. Here's how you pay your fares. And all of that was forgotten. And so we're living in the moment when the controversy is raging, but I think we're past that point of no return from where, things were in 2012 when that was an actual debate. And I think you'll see the same excitement because there's a reason that we're doing what we're doing. And, the costs are big, the benefits are huge. And that's really what this is about. And it's about the state being ambitious and delivering something that's different than what we have today, frankly, in terms of our transportation and rail network. And I think that'll be felt because if you've experienced it, you know what that's like. And it's something that, you at this point, you can't really take back. So I guess that's what I would leave you with is maybe some additional optimism that we're on the right path. There's more work to do, sure, but it's in a healthy place at the moment.
Awesome. Well, we'll leave with that. Boris and Roger, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.